The silence stretched across Kandahar airfield like a held breath. In the pre-dawn darkness, the only sounds were the distant hum of generators and the soft whisper of sand against concrete. But something was wrong. The kind of wrong that made seasoned flight controllers check their radar screens twice, then reach for encrypted phones with trembling fingers. At 3:47 hours, every military installation from Bagram to Ramstein received the same cryptic transmission. Package compromised. Asset in play. Execute nightfall protocol. Within minutes, scramble orders echoed through ready rooms across 3 continents. Pilots stumbled from bunks, still pulling on flight suits, demanding answers no one seemed to have. The mystery deepened when satellite imagery revealed what shouldn't exist: a formation of unidentified aircraft moving at impossible speeds through restricted airspace, their signatures unlike anything in any database. Russian, Chinese, something else entirely. The Pentagon's emergency response was swift and decisive: intercept and identify by any means necessary. But as alert fighters launched into the steel-gray dawn, a different kind of tension filled the operations center. Because among the call signs crackling over military frequencies, one stood out like a discordant note in a symphony: Falcon-12. The designation that had become synonymous with whispered jokes and barely concealed eye rolls throughout the 455th Air Expeditionary Wing. Major Kaya Thorne sat in the briefing room, her weathered flight gloves resting on the scarred wooden table as younger pilots filed in around her. At 34, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove, though the base seemed determined to remind her otherwise. Her call sign, Falcon-12, had been assigned during her first deployment, back when 12 was considered unlucky, when female fighter pilots were still curiosities rather than colleagues. Lucky 12, they called her, always with that particular smile that meant the opposite. The smile that said she was here because of quotas, not qualifications, that her 3 air-to-air kills were flukes, that her Distinguished Flying Cross was participation trophy disguised as valor. She'd heard the whispers in the mess hall, seen the sideways glances when she walked to her aircraft. Some pilots earned respect through bravado and war stories. Others commanded it through sheer skill. But Kaya Thorne had learned something different during her decade in cockpits. Sometimes respect had to be taken, one impossible mission at a time. The operations officer's voice cut through the morning briefing like a blade. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a situation developing in Sector 7 Alpha. Unknown aircraft, possibly hostile, moving at high speed toward friendly positions." His eyes swept the room, lingering for just a moment on Kaya's impassive face. This is not a drill. Outside, the first jets were already spooling up their engines, their turbines screaming against the desert silence. Soon, the sky would tell its story. The brief was unlike anything Kaya had experienced in 10 years of combat flying. The intelligence officer's hands shook slightly as he manipulated the digital display, showing radar contacts that appeared and vanished like ghosts. 3 formations of unknown aircraft, designation bandits, moving in perfect coordination through airspace that should have been impossible to penetrate. Electronic warfare suite indicates advanced stealth capabilities, the intel weenie continued, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. These aren't showing up on ground-based radar until they're practically on top of our installations. Whatever technology they're using, it's beyond anything in our threat assessment database. Squadron Leader Mitchell, call sign Viper 1, leaned forward in his chair. At 28, he embodied everything the Air Force loved to put on recruiting posters: square jaw, perfect teeth, and an ego that filled the room like cologne. "Sir, requesting permission to lead the intercept formation. My flight has the most recent air-to-air training hours." A murmur of agreement rippled through the younger pilots. This was their moment, their chance to prove themselves against an unknown enemy. Kaya remained silent, studying the tactical display with the patience of a hunter who had learned to read the spaces between information. "Negative, Viper 1, came the unexpected response from Colonel Barnes, the wing commander. "This isn't about training hours or recent qualifications." His weathered face carried the weight of combat decisions that kept him awake at 3 a.m. "These bandits are using tactics we've never seen, electronic countermeasures that shouldn't exist. If even half of what intelligence is telling us is accurate, we're dealing with technology that makes our best pilots look like student drivers." The room fell silent except for the low hum of air conditioning and the distant whine of jet engines. Every pilot in the briefing room had trained for this moment, the scramble order that would define careers, the mission that separated the competent from the legendary. But something in the colonel's tone suggested this was different. "The lead aircraft will need someone who understands how to fight when all the rules have changed," Barnes continued, his eyes finding Kaya's across the crowded room. "Someone who's been underestimated before and turned it into an advantage. Someone who knows how to win when victory seems impossible." Kaya felt the shift in the room's energy like a change in air pressure before a storm. Sideways glances, raised eyebrows, the kind of silence that preceded either applause or argument. She'd spent a decade earning her place in this brotherhood, only to discover that acceptance was always conditional, always one mission away from being revoked. "Falcon-12, Colonel Barnes said quietly. "You'll lead the intercept package. 4 aircraft, mixed loadout, full combat authority." The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down at a gunfight. Mitchell's chair scraped against the floor as he shifted forward. "Sir, with respect, Lucky 12 hasn't led a combat formation in—" "Major Thorne," Barnes interrupted, using her proper rank and name with deliberate emphasis, "has more combat flying hours than anyone in this room. 3 confirmed kills, 2 ground attack medals, and more importantly, she's the only pilot here who's successfully engaged unknown aircraft using unconventional tactics." The reference was to Kaya's last deployment, when she'd found herself alone against 2 enemy fighters using a damaged F-16, and nothing but altitude, patience, and a willingness to break every rule in the engagement manual. The after-action report had been classified, but whispers of her impossible victory had followed her across 3 bases. Now, as she stood to accept the mission that would either validate a decade of quiet competence or end her career in spectacular failure, Kaya felt the weight of every doubt, every whispered joke, every time she'd been passed over for the missions that mattered. The sky was calling, and for the first time in years, she was being invited to answer. The pre-flight ritual had always been sacred to Kaya, the methodical inspection of control surfaces, the gentle touch along the F-16's titanium skin, the whispered conversation between pilot and machine that no amount of training could teach. But this morning felt different. The aircraft seemed to sense it too, its sleek profile catching the early light like a blade eager for battle. "Falcon-12, you're looking good from here," came the voice of Senior Airman Rodriguez, her dedicated crew chief. In 3 deployments, Rodriguez had never once questioned Kaya's abilities or made jokes about her call sign. His respect had been earned through countless pre-dawn launches and bullet hole patches, through the kind of professional trust that transcended rank and gender. "Thanks, Chief," she replied, settling into the cockpit that had become more familiar than any home she'd ever known. The heads-up display flickered to life, painting the world in green symbols and targeting data. "How's she feeling today?" "Like she wants to remind some people why they shouldn't underestimate the quiet ones," Rodriguez said with a grin, securing her helmet connections. "Weapons hot, fuel topped off, and the radar's been tweaked to punch through electronic interference better than factory specs." Through the canopy, Kaya could see her wingmen completing their own pre-flight checks. Viper 1 in the lead Falcon position. Mitchell hadn't been able to hide his resentment at flying wing to a pilot he dismissed for years. Falcon 3 and Falcon 4 were younger officers, fresh from advanced training, their eagerness visible in every movement as they prepared for their first real combat mission. Falcon flight, this is Kandahar Tower, crackled the radio. Weather is clear, winds light and variable. Unknown aircraft last detected bearing 090, altitude unknown, speed classified as extremely fast. You are cleared for immediate departure. The tower controller's voice carried an undertone Kaya had heard before, the careful professionalism that masked genuine fear. Whatever was out there had rattled people who'd seen everything the modern battlefield could offer. Falcon flight copies, she responded, her voice carrying the calm authority that had taken years to develop. Beginning taxi procedures now. As her F-16 rolled toward the active runway, Kaya caught a glimpse of the operations building's windows. Faces pressed against the glass, controllers, intelligence officers, mechanics, and other pilots who weren't flying this morning. They were watching Falcon-12 lead her first combat formation in 3 years, probably wondering if the brass had finally lost their minds by trusting the lucky pilot with a mission this critical. Let them wonder, she thought, advancing the throttle as the runway stretched out before her like a promise. In minutes, she would be airborne, leading 3 other fighters into a confrontation with technology that shouldn't exist, piloted by adversaries whose capabilities remained a complete mystery. The tower frequency crackled one final time. Falcon-12, you are cleared for takeoff. Good hunting, Major. The afterburner's roar swallowed all doubt as Kaya Thorne accelerated into the dawn sky, her fighter climbing toward a horizon that held either vindication or destruction. Behind her, 3 other aircraft followed, their pilots about to discover whether Lucky 12 deserved her reputation or her call sign. At 15,000 feet, the morning sky stretched endlessly in all directions, painted in shades of gold and steel that reminded Kaya why she'd first fallen in love with flying. Up here, rank and politics and whispered jokes fell away like discarded weight. Up here, there was only the pure mathematics of thrust and lift, the honest conversation between pilot and physics that never lied about capability or worth. Falcon flight, level at 15,000, heading 090, she reported to the controller, whose voice had become increasingly tense over the past 10 minutes. Ready for vector to contact. Falcon-12, be advised. The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by static that made all 4 pilots check their radio equipment. When the controller returned, his voice carried the brittle edge of someone reading from a script he didn't fully understand. Unknown aircraft have been detected at your 2 o'clock position, distance approximately 40 miles. Altitude appears variable. Proceed with extreme caution. Mitchell's voice cut through the formation frequency with barely concealed skepticism. Falcon-12, requesting permission to take lead position. These contacts might require more aggressive. Negative, Viper 1, Kaya interrupted, her tone carrying the quiet authority of someone who had learned to command without raising her voice. Maintain formation. Unknown contacts require careful assessment before engagement. Through her heads-up display, the tactical picture began to develop like a photograph in Chemical Developer. Radar contacts appeared and vanished in patterns that defied conventional physics, moving at speeds that suggested either experimental technology or equipment malfunction. But Kaya had learned to trust her instincts over her instruments, especially when facing the impossible. Falcon 3, what are you seeing on your scope? She asked the youngest member of her formation, Lieutenant Sarah Kim, whose fresh perspective might catch details that experience had taught her to ignore. Ma'am, I'm getting intermittent contacts that appear to be dancing. Kim's voice carried the confusion of someone whose training had prepared her for conventional threats. They're moving in coordinated patterns, almost like they're performing some kind of aerial ballet. The description triggered a memory from Kaya's classified briefings. Intelligence reports about experimental aircraft using unconventional flight patterns to confuse targeting systems. But this felt different, more purposeful, as if the unknown pilots were deliberately displaying their capabilities rather than trying to hide them. "Falcon flight, Titan formation," she ordered, watching her wingmen slide closer until their aircraft moved like extensions of her own will. "Whatever we're about to face, we face it together. Trust your training, trust your aircraft, and trust each other." In the distance, barely visible against the morning haze, she caught her first glimpse of the unknown aircraft. They moved with the fluid grace of creatures born for the sky, their forms seeming to bend light itself as they approached with confidence that bordered on arrogance. The moment of first contact would define everything that followed. The unknown aircraft materialized from the haze like phantoms given substance, their forms unlike anything in Kaya's decade of military flying. Sleek and organic, they moved through the air with the fluid precision of sharks cutting through deep water. No visible engines, no contrails, no conventional control surfaces, just pure, impossible grace that made her F-16 feel like a museum piece. "Jesus Christ," whispered Lieutenant Torres from Falcon-12, his voice tight with awe and fear. "Are those even aircraft?" "Maintain radio discipline," Kaya commanded, though she shared his amazement. The three unknown craft flew in perfect triangular formation, their surfaces seeming to shift and shimmer as if constructed from liquid mercury. Advanced stealth technology, she told herself, but the rational explanation felt inadequate against the evidence of her own eyes. "Falcon-12, this is Kandahar Control." The controller's voice cracked slightly despite his professional training. "Unknown aircraft are not responding to any communication attempts. International emergency frequencies, military channels, even commercial aviation bands. Complete radio silence." Through her helmet's targeting system, Kaya studied the lead aircraft more closely. Approximately 40 feet in length, no visible cockpit or pilot compartment, moving at speeds that should have generated massive sonic signatures but producing no sound at all. The craft's surface rippled with patterns of light that reminded her of Aurora Borealis, beautiful and deeply unsettling. "Falcon-12, requesting permission to establish weapons lock." Mitchell's voice carried the eager tension of a pilot who had trained his entire career for a moment like this. "These bogies are clearly hostile. We should engage while we have tactical advantage." "Negative, Viper 1. No aggressive action without clear hostile intent." Kaya's response came from hard-won experience of situations where shooting first meant asking questions in the aftermath of international incidents. "Unknown aircraft have not demonstrated threatening behavior. We observe and report." But even as she spoke, the tactical situation began to shift. The three unknown craft suddenly accelerated, their formation spreading into a pattern that experienced fighter pilots would recognize as an attack approach. Not hostile yet, but preparing to be. "All Falcon aircraft, this is your lead," Kaya transmitted, her voice carrying the calm authority that came from making life-or-death decisions at 400 miles per hour. "Weapons systems to standby. Maintain visual contact. Do not lock targeting systems without direct authorization." The lead unknown aircraft suddenly changed course, banking into a turn that should have been impossible at its current speed. No aircraft in any air force could generate those G-forces without killing its pilot. Unless, Kaya realized with growing unease, there was no pilot to kill. "Falcon-12, crackled the radio. "Be advised that NORAD is tracking additional unknown aircraft approaching from multiple vectors. You are no longer dealing with an isolated incident. This appears to be a coordinated probe of our air defense network." The morning sky had become a chessboard, and Kaya was beginning to understand that her four aircraft might be facing something that would redefine the very nature of aerial warfare. The tactical display in Kaya's cockpit resembled a video game designed by someone with too much imagination and too little concern for the laws of physics. Red symbols representing unknown aircraft appeared and vanished across a 100-mile radius, their movements defying every principle of aerodynamics she had spent her career mastering. "Falcon-12, "This is AWACS Overlord," came the voice of the airborne command post, its tone carrying the careful neutrality of professionals watching their understanding of reality get rewritten in real time. "We're tracking at least 18 unknown aircraft operating in your theater. Recommend immediate return to base for reassessment." Before Kaya could respond, the lead unknown aircraft executed a maneuver that made her brain struggle to process what her eyes were reporting. The craft stopped mid-flight, not slowed, not turned, but simply ceased forward motion as if momentum was a suggestion rather than a physical law. For 3 heartbeats it hung motionless in the sky, then accelerated to impossible speed in a direction perpendicular to its original course. "Did you guys see that?" Lieutenant Kim's voice carried the kind of wonder usually reserved for children witnessing magic tricks. "That thing just stopped in midair at 300 knots." Mitchell's response dripped with the skepticism of someone whose worldview was being challenged. "Equipment malfunction. Has to be. Nothing can move like that." But Kaya had seen enough impossible things during her career to know that dismissing evidence rarely made it go away. The unknown aircraft weren't operating under the same physical constraints as conventional fighters, which meant conventional tactics would be worse than useless. They would be suicidal. "Falcon flight, new plan," she announced, her mind already working through alternatives that training manuals had never considered. "We're not dealing with aircraft as we understand them. Standard engagement protocols are compromised. We adapt or we die." The lead unknown craft suddenly accelerated directly toward her formation, closing the distance with predatory intent that made every survival instinct scream warnings. But instead of attacking, it stopped again, this time less than 1,000 feet from Falcon-12's nose, close enough for Kaya to see details that made her question her own sanity. The craft's surface wasn't solid metal or composite materials. It rippled and flowed like liquid, occasionally revealing glimpses of internal structures that seemed to rearrange themselves as she watched. No pilot compartment, no weapons pods, no conventional control surfaces. Whatever intelligence guided this thing wasn't human. "Falcon-12, the radio crackled with new urgency. "Unknown aircraft are now appearing over friendly installations worldwide. This is no longer a regional incident. This is global." As if responding to the transmission, all 3 unknown aircraft suddenly projected beams of coherent light, not lasers, but something that made the air itself glow with patterns that hurt to look at directly. The beams swept across Kaya's formation in what could only be described as scanning, as if her aircraft were specimens being examined by researchers. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the unknown aircraft began to withdraw, accelerating to speeds that left sonic booms echoing across the desert floor. But their departure felt less like retreat and more like the end of a first meeting, a formal introduction between civilizations that had finally acknowledged each other's existence. "Falcon-12, came the voice from Kandahar Control, tight with barely controlled panic. "Return to base immediately. The Pentagon wants a full debrief. And Major Thorne, whatever just happened out there, you and your flight are the only military pilots who have had direct contact with these things and lived to talk about it." As Kaya banked her F-16 toward home, she realized that her reputation as Lucky 12 was about to take on an entirely new meaning. The debrief room at Kandahar had been transformed into something resembling a war room from a techno-thriller movie. Multiple screens displayed radar tracks from around the globe, intelligence officers huddled over encrypted communications equipment, and video feeds from air bases across 3 continents showed the same story. Unknown aircraft appearing without warning, demonstrating impossible capabilities, then vanishing as mysteriously as they had arrived. Kaya sat at the head of a polished conference table, still wearing her flight suit, facing a collection of senior officers whose combined experience represented nearly 2 centuries of military aviation. But today, Their expertise felt as obsolete as propeller-driven fighters in the jet age. "Major Thorne," began General Morrison, his 4 stars carrying less weight than usual in a room where all assumptions had been discarded. "Your flight is the only military formation to achieve sustained visual contact with the unknown aircraft. What's your professional assessment?" The question carried implications that extended far beyond routine after-action reports. Every word would be analyzed, documented, and potentially classified at levels that removed them from normal human discourse. But Kaya had learned that truth was often more valuable than diplomacy. "Sir, these aren't aircraft as we understand the term," she began, choosing her words with the precision of someone diffusing explosives. "No visible propulsion, no conventional control surfaces, movement patterns that violate basic physics. The craft appeared to be scanning us, gathering information rather than engaging in combat." Colonel Barnes, her wing commander, leaned forward with the intensity of someone whose career might depend on the next few minutes of conversation. "Major, are you suggesting these craft are piloted by non-human intelligence?" The room fell silent except for the low hum of electronic equipment and the distant sound of aircraft operations continuing outside. Every person present understood that crossing certain lines of speculation would transform their careers and possibly their lives in ways that couldn't be predicted or undone. "Sir, I'm suggesting that conventional explanations are inadequate for what we observed," Kaya replied carefully. "The technology demonstrated capabilities that are decades, possibly centuries, beyond current human engineering. Whether that technology is piloted, autonomous, or something else entirely is beyond my ability to determine." Lieutenant Kim, the youngest pilot in the formation, raised her hand tentatively. "Ma'am, permission to speak freely." When General Morrison nodded, she continued, "The scanning beams they used. I've seen similar patterns in quantum physics research. Coherent light used to analyze material composition at the molecular level, like they were studying us." Mitchell, who had remained silent during most of the debrief, finally spoke up. "With respect, we're making assumptions based on incomplete information. Advanced stealth technology, experimental propulsion systems, electronic warfare capabilities we haven't encountered before. None of this requires exotic explanations." But even as he spoke, his voice carried less conviction than usual. Everyone in the room had seen the footage, watched radar tracks that showed aircraft performing maneuvers that would have turned human pilots into paste. "The question," General Morrison said quietly, "is what happens next. These incidents occurred simultaneously across multiple continents. Whoever or whatever is responsible has demonstrated the ability to penetrate our most advanced air defense networks at will. They've observed our capabilities, studied our responses, and withdrawn on their own terms." He paused, looking directly at Kaya with the weight of command decisions that would ripple across decades. "Major Thorne, based on your direct contact with these entities, what would you recommend as our next course of action?" The question hung in the air like a sword suspended by silk thread. Everything Kaya said in the next few moments would help shape humanity's response to the most significant development in the history of warfare. Kaya felt the weight of history settling on her shoulders like lead blankets, each star and ribbon in the room representing years of conventional warfare that might have become irrelevant in the span of a single morning. The faces around the conference table belonged to warriors who had devoted their lives to mastering the art of aerial combat, only to discover that the rules had been rewritten by forces they couldn't comprehend. "Sir, I recommend we abandon the assumption that this is a military threat in any conventional sense," she began, her voice carrying the steady confidence that had earned grudging respect from pilots who had initially dismissed her as a diversity hire. "The unknown aircraft demonstrated overwhelming technological superiority. If their intent had been hostile, we would already be discussing casualty reports rather than contact protocols." General Morrison's weathered face showed the strain of a career spent preparing for threats that followed predictable patterns. Are you suggesting we should view this as diplomatic contact? The word hung in the air like an unexploded ordnance, carrying implications that extended far beyond military command structures. First contact protocols existed in theoretical documents, academic papers, and science fiction novels, but no one had expected to invoke them during a routine scramble mission over Afghanistan. I'm suggesting that superior technology combined with restrained behavior indicates intelligence that understands the concept of graduated response. Kaya continued, aware that every word was being recorded for analysis by individuals whose security clearances existed in realms she couldn't imagine. They could have engaged us. They chose to observe. That's the behavior of researchers, not conquerors. Lieutenant Torres, who had remained silent throughout most of the debrief, suddenly spoke up. Ma'am, when the scanning beams hit our aircraft, my instruments detected energy patterns that seemed to be communicating. Not radio transmission, but some kind of data exchange. Like they were trying to establish protocols. Colonel Barnes sat forward sharply. Lieutenant, you're suggesting these craft attempted to communicate with your aircraft's computer systems. Yes, sir. And I think they might have succeeded. Tor's voice carried the uncertainty of someone who had discovered something that training had never prepared him to handle. My navigation computer recorded data sequences that don't match any known format, but they're too organized to be random interference. The room erupted in low conversations between intelligence officers and technical specialists, voices carrying the urgent tone of professionals who had stumbled onto something that would require entirely new categories of classification. But General Morrison's voice cut through the discussion like a blade. Major Thorne, assuming your assessment is correct, that we're dealing with beings whose technology renders our military capabilities obsolete, what would you recommend as our immediate response? Kaya looked around the room at faces that represented the finest military minds of their generation, all waiting for guidance from a pilot who had spent her career being underestimated, dismissed, and relegated to missions that others considered beneath their dignity. The irony wasn't lost on her that Lucky 12 was being asked to help navigate humanity's first contact with superior intelligence. Sir, I recommend we prepare for the possibility that they'll return, she said quietly. And when they do, we should be ready to communicate rather than fight, because based on what I observed today, fighting is an option we don't actually have. The silence that followed carried the weight of civilization, standing at the threshold of transformation. 3 hours after the debrief ended, Kaya found herself alone in the pilot's ready room, staring at a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. The space felt different now, as if the morning's events had altered the fundamental nature of reality itself. Maps on the walls showing threat vectors and engagement zones seemed like artifacts from a simpler time when warfare followed predictable patterns. Her secure phone buzzed with a message that made her blood pressure spike. Report to base commander immediately. Bring flight gear. The kind of summons that typically preceded either decoration ceremonies or court-martial proceedings, with little middle ground between celebration and career destruction. 20 minutes later, she stood in General Morrison's office facing a collection of individuals whose presence suggested that morning's events had attracted attention from levels of government she had only heard referenced in whispered conversations. Men and women in expensive suits, carrying briefcases that probably contained secrets that could redefine human civilization. Major Thorne, General Morrison began, his voice carrying the careful formality of someone operating under direct orders from Washington. Based on your unique experience with the unknown aircraft, you have been selected for a classified assignment that extends far beyond normal military protocols. One of the suited individuals stepped forward, a woman in her 50s whose bearing suggested intelligence community credentials that ran deeper than most people's family trees. Major, I'm Dr. Sarah Chen from a research division that doesn't appear on any organizational charts. The technology you encountered this morning represents a development that could fundamentally alter the balance of global power. We need someone who has demonstrated the ability to interact with these entities without triggering hostilities. Kaya felt the familiar sensation of standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that the next step would either launch her into flight or send her tumbling into an abyss from which there was no return. Ma'am, are you asking me to serve as humanity's ambassador to an unknown intelligence? We're asking you to do what you've always done, General Morrison replied. Fly into impossible situations and find ways to survive them. Except this time, survival might depend more on communication than combat capability. Dr. Chen opened her briefcase and withdrew a tablet displaying satellite imagery from around the globe. The unknown aircraft have appeared over major population centers on every continent. London, Tokyo, New York, Moscow. They're conducting systematic observation of human civilization. Pattern analysis suggests they're preparing for more extensive contact. The images showed craft identical to those Kaya had encountered, hovering motionless over landmarks that represented centuries of human achievement. The Tower of London, Mount Fuji, the Statue of Liberty, as if the visitors were studying humanity's cultural and historical significance rather than military capabilities. Your mission, Dr. Chen continued, is to establish a protocol for sustained communication. Based on Lieutenant Tor's technical analysis, these beings have already demonstrated the ability to interface with our computer systems. We need someone who can serve as a human element in that communication process. Kaya looked around the room at faces that represented power structures she had spent her career navigating, all waiting for her response to a question that would define not just her future, but potentially the future of human civilization. When do I start? She asked quietly, because Lucky 12 had never learned how to walk away from impossible odds. The flight to Nevada took place in a transport aircraft whose interior had been stripped of everything except essential equipment and a collection of monitoring devices that belonged in a science fiction movie. Kaya sat strapped into a seat that felt more like a laboratory chair, surrounded by technicians whose security clearances probably required psychological evaluations and polygraph examinations administered by people who didn't officially exist. Dr. Chen sat across from her, reviewing files on a tablet whose screen automatically darkened whenever anyone else looked in its direction. Major, what I'm about to tell you is classified at levels that have never been used before. The morning's contact event wasn't entirely unexpected. Kaya felt the familiar tightness in her chest that preceded revelations that would reshape everything she thought she understood about reality. Ma'am, are you saying the government knew these craft would appear? We're saying that certain signals have been detected for the past 18 months. Deep space monitoring stations recorded transmissions that suggested intelligence operating beyond our solar system. The technology you encountered today appears to represent the source of those signals. The transport aircraft banked into its final approach toward an airfield that didn't appear on any civilian maps, its runway carved into desert landscape that stretched endlessly in all directions. Through the small window, Kaya could see aircraft hangars whose dimensions suggested they were designed to house something much larger than conventional fighters. The facility you're about to see is designated Site 51 Alpha, Dr. Chen continued, apparently unaware of the irony in her nomenclature choice. It houses our most advanced research into aerospace technologies that challenge conventional understanding. Some of that research has become significantly more relevant in the past 24 hours. As the transport touched down, Kaya caught sight of aircraft that made her question whether the morning's contact had been as unprecedented as everyone assumed. Sleek, angular fighters whose design philosophy seemed to incorporate lessons learned from studying something other than human engineering. Test aircraft that moved with the fluid grace she had observed in the unknown craft. "Major," Dr. Chen said quietly as the engines wound down, "everything you thought you knew about the limits of human technology is about to change. The question is whether you're prepared to help humanity take its next evolutionary step, or whether you'd prefer to remain in a universe where the only intelligence in the cosmos happens to be terrestrial." The hangar doors opened to reveal a facility that existed at the intersection of military precision and scientific imagination. Kaya stepped onto a runway that felt like the threshold between everything she had known and everything she was about to discover. Behind her, the transport's engines were already spooling up for departure, carrying away the last connection to a world where Lucky 12 was just another pilot with an unfortunate call sign. Ahead lay responsibilities that would either establish her as humanity's bridge to the stars, or as the woman who had accidentally started an interstellar war. The hangar complex stretched underground for levels that seemed to descend toward the planet's core, each floor representing decades of research into technologies that officially didn't exist. Kaya followed Dr. Chen through corridors lined with laboratories where technicians in pristine white coats worked on equipment that belonged in universities that wouldn't be built for another century. "The Prometheus Project," Dr. Chen explained as they walked past chambers containing aircraft components that seemed to bend light around their surfaces, "began in 1987, when a deep space monitoring station detected the first artificial signals from outside our solar system. Everything you see here represents 35 years of reverse engineering, theoretical research, and preparation for the moment when contact became inevitable." They paused before a massive window overlooking a hangar that housed an aircraft unlike anything in Kaya's experience. Approximately 60 feet in length, its surface rippled with the same liquid mercury appearance she had observed in the unknown craft, but its overall configuration suggested human engineering adapted to incorporate impossible principles. "The Aurora prototype," Dr. Chen said quietly. "Our first successful attempt to replicate the propulsion technology observed in recovered materials. It can achieve speeds that would be fatal to human pilots using conventional life support systems." Kaya stared at the craft, her mind struggling to process implications that extended far beyond military applications. "Recovered materials, ma'am. Are you saying we've had physical samples of this technology?" "We're saying that this morning's contact wasn't the first time unknown aircraft have visited Earth," came a new voice from behind them. Kaya turned to see a man in his 60s, whose bearing suggested military background, and whose eyes carried the weight of secrets that could rewrite human history. "Colonel James Harrison, retired," he introduced himself. "Former test pilot, current director of the Prometheus Project's Flight Operations Division. I've been flying aircraft that don't officially exist for the better part of 2 decades, preparing for the moment when we would need pilots capable of operating in environments that challenge human physiology." Dr. Chen gestured toward the observation deck's control panel. "Major Thorne, based on your successful contact with unknown aircraft, you have been selected to undergo training in systems that incorporate technologies recovered from previous encounters. Your mission will be to serve as humanity's representative in communications that extend beyond conventional diplomatic protocols." Through the hangar's massive doors, Kaya could see additional aircraft in various stages of construction, their designs representing evolution from human engineering towards something that transcended terrestrial limitations. Test pilots moved between the craft with the casual competence of individuals who had learned to operate in realms where physics was more suggestion than law. The unknown aircraft that appeared this morning were conducting final assessment of human capabilities, Colonel Harrison continued. "Pattern analysis suggests they've been observing our technological development for decades, waiting for us to reach a threshold that would justify direct contact. Kaya looked at the Aurora prototype, understanding that her next flight would take her further from home than any pilot in human history. Not in terms of distance, but in terms of the fundamental nature of what it meant to be human operating in a universe that was far more complex than anyone had imagined.